If you don't know me, my name is Brandon. I'm one of the pastors of the church. I have the privilege of serving alongside Pastor Chado. Pastor Chado gave a little bit of a history of our church, how we got here. And as he mentioned, we're a type of what's called a church plant. And so if you're wondering, what does that mean? Well, if you think about a plant, it's like a seed. It's small. You water it, it grows. So we think churches operate in a similar fashion. A few of us, in some ways, restarted a church here when First Southern Baptist had kind of fizzled out. And we started with some people, a small group of people, and we've been thankful to God to see it continue to grow. And so if you're here, you're checking us out for the first time, I want you to know we're so thankful that you're here. In many ways, everything we do here is for you. Because if you see on our sign out there, we say we love Jesus, we love our city, we want the two to meet, and that's who we are. We love Jesus, specifically the Jesus that the Bible shows us, gives us, tells us about. We love this city, as Pastor Chado mentioned. We love the city of Fairmont, as well as the surrounding cities, and we want people from the city to meet the person of Jesus. And so if you're here and you don't know Jesus, we want you to know that we're here for you, that we might tell you of Jesus. Usually here at Crossroads, we tend to preach most commonly straight through a book of the Bible, but from time to time, we'll step back and we will preach a series on a relevant topic that's rooted in the themes of the Bible, and that's what we're doing right now. We're going through a series called People of Sorrow. The reason that this series seemed good to preach and is relevant is because we all deal with sorrow in this world. And because of the sin of our first parents, Adam and Eve, we now live in a world that's cursed and that brings various levels of pain into all of our lives. Things like relational strife, financial calamities, chronic pain, and even the death of loved ones and our own impending death. So these are all now very common realities in the world that we live in. And this is true for all people. It's true for people that are Christians, it's true for people that are not. And so the question then becomes, is what is God doing in my pain? How should I understand what is happening? This series has three aims for us. The first aim is to provide hope to Christians, for people who follow Jesus, by showing that our suffering is not strange. That's the first aim. The second aim is to encourage Christians that our suffering is actually what most qualifies us for ministry. And our third hope is to hold up Jesus Christ as the man of sorrows, who is a comforting Savior for people of sorrow like us. So today's sermon, we're going to look at a person in the Bible. Today's sermon, the title is going to be David and the King. I want to invite you to go ahead and turn to Psalm 142, Psalm 142. If you have a Bible or a Bible app, turn there. If you have neither, there's probably a black hardcover Bible maybe beneath your seats or beneath a seat around you. You can feel free to pick that up. If you need a Bible, you can feel free to take that as our gift to you. But Psalm 142. One of my kids' favorite things to do is to read stories. It seems from the earliest ages, they love a good story. They love to figure out all the different parts of the story. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? If your kids are like my kids, sometimes they just wish there is no bad guy. But they still want to find the parts. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? And most importantly, where is the happy ending? I think this is true for many of us. I think it's because we're in a way, we're hardwired to love a good story. We tend to daydream about our lives as we grow, right? When we're young, we do it. And sometimes even as we grow older, we daydream, we picture this happy ending for our lives. But sometimes that happy ending we picture doesn't come, does it? Sometimes tragedy strikes, pain comes in, and sorrow takes control of the story. And then we are left wondering, where's the happy ending? Is it ever going to come? Where do we turn when we are stuck in our sorrows and there's no clear path forward? We're going to be looking today at a man named David. David was chosen by God to be the king of God's people. David had the happy ending mapped out from the very beginning, and that is until the current king started hunting him to take his life. And at one point, David finds himself on the run for fear of his life, hiding in a cave and unsure of where this might all end up and how he's going to get to this place where he actually is the king of this people like God had said. And it's in this place of sorrow, literally hiding in a cave, that he writes Psalm 142. I invite you to stand, if you're willing and able, for the reading of God's word from Psalm 142. David says this under the inspiration of God. With my voice, I cry out to the Lord. With my voice, I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. When my spirit faints within me, you know my way. In the place where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see, there is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul. I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of prison that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. This is the word of the Lord for us today. You guys can be seated. The main point for our sermon today, if there's one thing that I want to encourage you to take away, if you're a note taker, if you don't take any notes more than this one, write this one down, because we're going to come back to it again and again, and it's this: Jesus is our shelter in the sorrow. Jesus is our shelter in the sorrow. We're going to look at 4 points. We're going to see that God humbled his king, that God knows our distress, that God hears our prayers, and that God rescued his king. As we get ready to jump in, it's something I must say, one of the unique things about being the person who stands up here and does this is that I'm under obligation to always preach what is true from God's word, even when its reality is far from my own life. And I don't know a person more prone to complaining and to self-pity and to all manner of horrible things under sorrow than me. And that's not an exaggeration. I don't know a person more prone to those things. And so I want you to know that as we go through really this entire series, I am consistently repenting and asking God to teach me as I would attempt to teach any of us how to walk through these things. And I'm just burdened for you to know that. Like, we face hard stuff, and we're prone to all manner of nastiness that comes out of us. And I don't know anybody that does it more than me. And I'm laying that before the Lord, and I hope that we would do that together and learn how to, as our sermon today will say, find Jesus to be our shelter in the sorrow. Pray for me, and I'll pray for you. So let's look at our text. Let's jump in. First point, God humbled his king. So we're going to step out of the text a little bit. We're going to talk about who is this man, David. Give a little bit of a picture. David is a man who will eventually become the most famous king in the Old Testament. He really oversees a type of glory days for ancient Israel. His reign as king is so significant that when Jesus comes on the scene, about 1,000 years after David's reign as king, there are actually many people in Israel who are hoping that Jesus is going to be a type of David who will liberate them from political enemies and return them to national prominence. So it's 1,000 years later. It's like George Washington was here like 300 years ago. So understand, and we would maybe have a reverence for like the founding fathers in America. This is 1,000 years, and they're still just hoping for David to come back or somebody like him. That's how significant that his reign as king ended up being in Israel. And a brief timeline of David's life shows that he was indeed a man that God used significantly and was blessed by God in really significant ways. But we also see that he was a man who suffered significantly. One significant source of his pain came in relation to another king named Saul. So if we were to trace David's life in a book in the Old Testament called 1 Samuel that would trace his relationship with this king named Saul, we would see a few things. Some things that'll be really familiar probably to many of you because they still play big in the cultural vernacular. So for instance, in 1 Samuel 16, David's story kind of starts. He's chosen by God to be king when he's a shepherd boy. And not only is he chosen by God, but he's kind of commended by God in the process because the prophet Samuel at the time sees, he's looking for the man that God calls king, and then he sees this guy that's like strapping, he's like 6'5", muscles coming out of his eyeballs. Samuel's like, it must be that guy, and God's like, no, it's not, because you look at the outside, I look at the heart, and it's actually this little shepherd boy over here. Now, David turns into a mighty warrior, But I'm saying that to say not only is David chosen by God, in a sense, he's commended for the state of his heart by God. He's like, I'm choosing him because it's not about his size, it's about the posture of his heart. So that's where David's story starts. And then in 1 Samuel 17, the really famous story is where David defeats Goliath. Right? Goliath is this massive Shaquille O'Neal-sized person who's like mocking the Israelites, come and fight me. And David comes up, all like 5'2" of them, and says, you have defied my God and his people, and you will do it no more. And he just pulls out a rock and a slingshot and cracks him in the temple, and it's over. And that's one of the most famous stories we still have, especially if you're sports. Like we still use the David and Goliath thing all the time, right? So David, that happens in 1 Samuel 17. So David has great success in many things. In fact, in 1 Samuel 18, we're seeing this success grow and grow and grow. And the text tells us that. But there's also a problem for David that begins to grow in 1 Samuel 18. And that's that Saul is growing increasingly jealous of this new king who is starting to come onto the scene and to be seen. And so that whole thing actually escalates really quickly because in 1 Samuel 18, David's jealousy is first expressed by throwing a spear at David. That just seems crazy, right? Like most of the time our jealousy is expressed in like little backhanded comments and gossip, and Saul just goes right for the jugular. He's like, I'm just going to hit you with a spear. So when that doesn't work, he actually throws it and he misses. Then Saul sends him to battle, intentionally hoping that he'll die. Like that's his plan, is to send him to battle so that he'll die. That doesn't work because David turns into a mighty warrior. And so then he sends hitmen to sit outside of his house to kill him when he comes out. These things continue and escalate to the point where David in 1 Samuel 19 and 20, he actually has to run away from Israel in order to protect his own life. He has to run away from his home, run away from his people, run away from the nation that God had chosen him to be king of. It's probably safe to say that a lot of this wasn't happening according to how David thought things might get mapped out when Samuel had anointed him to be the king of God's people. And in fact, as the text continues in 1 Samuel, the narrative, we see pictures of the sorrow and the desperation that David is living under while he's on the run from King Saul. He does things like he lies to a priest in order to get a sword from him so he can protect himself. We see him, he actually fakes being insane at one point, like starts dribbling all over himself because he runs into previous war enemies while he's running from Saul and they're trying to kill him. So he acts like a madman so they can just let him go. Like these are the depths to which he's being reduced. He's hiding in several caves, like multiple caves. He's basically cave hopping while he's hearing of Saul on a murderous rampage looking for him. Like at one point, a story comes to him where he hears that Saul has murdered a group of priests that he thinks has helped David. And those are the stories that David's hearing. And this whole scenario, perhaps this is the weightiest part I want you to hear. This whole scenario goes on for likely somewhere between 7 to 10 years. That's how long this story. We don't know exactly how long because the dates, we don't have exact dates in this story, but there's things you can pick up along the way, and people assume between 7 to 10 years this is going on for David, where he's just running for his life. David was anointed to be king by God, and then he spends several years living as a bandit on the run away from the nation he's supposed to lead. He faces constant danger from a jealous king that he has only ever honored and served. He faces dangers from enemies that he acquired while fighting for this king. And eventually he faces pressure, criticism, and even danger from the men who had come with him. And all of this for the man that God had chosen to be king. Perhaps the hardest part for David in this whole scenario is that he's essentially powerless because there's nobody to appeal to above Saul. He's the highest authority in the land. David is at the complete mercy of God. David recognizes as much in 1 Samuel 26 when he basically gives a picture of how this scenario is going to end. And he says, quote, "As the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish." And basically, until that point, all David can do is wait and try to survive until that day comes. So how does this story of David's sorrow begin to apply to us and ours? Well, first, David is suffering at the hands of the king, and sometimes we might suffer at the hands of wicked authorities. It can be tyrannical governments who distort media narratives to manipulate us. It can be bad bosses who act like little kings with no accountability. Sometimes our sorrow, like David, is caused by evil authorities, and there's nobody for us to be able to appeal to above them. We're kind of stuck in it. And sometimes our sorrow, while not caused by a wicked authority, can still be similar in the fact that we are just stuck with it, or we feel stuck with it with no clear path forward. We might have physical pain that doctors can't seem to figure out or fix. We might have relationships that are strained over years and years of frustration and fighting that just don't seem to have a clear path forward. We can have soul afflictions like anxiety, depression, things that we carry that just don't seem to have a quick fix or any fix to them. We can struggle with all manners of addictions or wrestles with our sinful flesh that we just struggle with and wonder, will this ever actually end? But unlike David, we have the benefit of hindsight because we can see a few things about David. We can see that David was suffering at the hands of his God, and this formed a character and a dependence upon God that prepared him eventually to be king. And as we talked about last week, as hard as this is to wrap around, our real hope is that our pain is controlled by our God. And so this prepares us to serve him because our sorrows form a character in us that betters us for service to Jesus. And it shapes us to be with Jesus because our sorrows are shaping us into a people that look like Jesus when we see him. Finally, we have great hope because David's figurative cross that he carried for many years did indeed lead to a crown. And more importantly, that's a picture of Jesus who carried a cross that led to a crown. And so will this outcome be ours who have trust in him through our sorrows. So that's our first point, is that God humbled his king. Our second point is that we're going to jump into Psalm 142 and see that God knows our distress. I'm going to read verses 1 to 3a, which is like the first half of verse 3. He says, "With my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. When my spirit faints within me, you know my way." The first thing I want us to see here is that our sorrows are not strange to God. Because as David says, he knows our path. David says, "When my spirit faints within me, you know my way." You know about me. You know what's happening to me. A really old pastor named Matthew Henry said this, quote, "When our spirits are overwhelmed by distress and filled with discouragement, when we see snares laid for us on every side, while we walk in God's way, we may reflect with comfort that the Lord knows our path." It's encouraging that God knows our path, as the text says. And in fact, that the Psalms in general, all of the Psalms, give us good language for our sorrows that can be really helpful to us. Because pain is something that's not often expressed logically. Rather, it's expressed most faithfully through types of dramatic words and illustrations, right? That's why there's jokes, but it's real. That's why we go through an emo phase and we really like that heavy music, right? Because there's something in us that ministers to that because they're giving voice to something with dramatic language that ministers to us in our pain. We should be thankful that this psalm has many of those kind of things. Notice the words of David. He says, "I cry out to God." Right? This is not a man who's giving a little prayer. I cry out to God. I plead for mercy. My spirit faints within me. He asked God to bring him out of prison. He wasn't in a prison. He was in a cave, but he wasn't in a literal prison. What's happening? He's giving dramatic language, and we can feel that, can't we? If we're honest, we know what it feels like that this would be an appropriate expression for us to cry out, to plead, to know the spirit fainting within us, to feel as though we're in a prison and trapped. It's dramatic language. It helps give voice to our feelings and our sorrows. And firstly, we should see, certainly God knows our path because David tells us in the text, but the Psalms show us that God knows us and has gifted us with language that fits the bill. And the Psalms in general, are a great encouragement to us because of that. There's a type of encouragement we should be able to find here as well, because it also tells us, when we look at David, when we look at all the people in this series, focusing on David now, it tells us that we're not especially that we're not really unique. Our sorrows are not necessarily unique. And that's important for us to know. Now, to be clear, it doesn't lessen the weight of it, doesn't remove the burden. And I don't mean to ignore the reality that some of our sorrows can be more or less unique in a relative sense compared to others. There are some that are more common in the actuality of them than others. But the experience of sorrow for God's people is not unique. The anointed king of God's people, David, again, is the one who is crying out to God. He's going to become the greatest king in the history of God's people. And this is where he is. He is pleading to God for mercy. He is telling him of all of his complaints and his troubles. And there should be, and I think there is, a strange sort of comfort in that. It might be a comfort because, as we like to say, misery loves company. But I don't think that. I think it's more than that, because I think that what's often hiding when we're in our pain, suffering, or sorrows, what's often hiding that sometimes we see and sometimes we don't is a fear that we are just really messed up. Like alone, forsaken, like we're just really screwed up. Way more than anybody else. And the comfort comes from knowing in a real way, not really, you're just messed up like the rest of us. Like we're all in this together in a real way. And that there are many people that we can look at through history that have faced similar things as well. This is also a good reason why we should learn to share our burdens with one another. Because your sorrows might match the sorrows of another, and your sharing might just be the very thing that helps another's head to come back above water. We should share our burdens with people who aren't Christians, so we might share where our hope is. Because the people we work with, we live around, our kids play soccer with, they all have burdens too, but they don't have any hope. Not any real hope. They have self-help books that are telling them to sort of just get it going, or they're numbing it with various substances, or they're doing something to deal with it. But perhaps God is keeping a burden in your life so you might learn to share Christ with others who have a similar burden that you are uniquely shaped by God to speak into. So we should learn to share our burdens with those who aren't Christians. We should learn to share them with one another. Again, so we can find a type of camaraderie and love through shared sorrows and help one another forward toward Christ. And in order to do that, we have to get away from all tendencies towards a type of self-sufficiency that just tends to keep our burdens to ourselves. Now, I'm not talking about oversharing. That's real. We can be like over the top and a little weird. But I'm just talking about being willing to share an honest assessment of your heart and your life with other brothers and sisters. We should do that for a couple reasons. One of the biggest ones is this, is that to be self-sufficient is to be God deficient. I want to say that again. To be self-sufficient is to be God deficient. Because God created the first man, Adam, to live in a dependent relationship with him. And then the second Adam, Jesus, comes on the scene and tells us over and over again that he does nothing apart from his Father. And finally, the goal of the Christian life is to be made more like Jesus, right? Well, Jesus asked his friends to pray for him in the garden. You guys remember that? Do you know that story? And it wasn't a general prayer. It wasn't an unspoken prayer request. In Matthew 26:38, he asks his friends to pray for him because he says he is sorrowful unto death. Like, this is the Son of God, and he looks at his friends, and he basically says, I'm so sad that I feel like I could die. Will you please pray for me? Do we ever talk like that with one another? Are we above talking like that? Are we too prim and proper to ask of prayer the way Jesus does? I know that the language gets a little funny, so sorrowful unto death doesn't sound as desperate as it actually is, but if you break apart what he's saying, he's like, I'm in absolute anguish. Will you please pray for me? So it's a little bit of a test that I would just lay before you. When somebody asks you how they can pray for you, how do you usually answer? Do you answer in generalities, hyper-spiritualities, the dreaded unspoken prayer request? I want to talk about that last one for a minute, only because I think it highlights something. And if you've been one to do that, like, my desire is not to hate on you. I know it's a big thing and it's been picked up. And so hear what I'm saying with love. But I do want to punch at that idea because I think that idea represents a lot of things that are unchristian that we need to just throw away. The reason I say that is because the unspoken prayer request, that sort of thing is basically telling somebody, like, I don't want you in my life at all. I don't want you to know anything about my business. I'm just open to receiving some type of benefit you might be able to give to me by praying for me. Like, if that's hard on you, come talk to me after, we'll work it out. But I don't know another thing that's ultimately communicating. And that is completely opposite of the way that Christians are called to live together, to bear one another's burdens. I can't bear a burden if you don't tell me what it is. And if you don't trust me enough to tell me even a little bit. Like, unspoken prayer requests is just like, it doesn't get us anywhere. We shouldn't do it. When somebody comes, how often do you say something, when somebody asks you, how can I pray for you? How often do you say something like, hey, I'm dealing with this really strong area of temptation. Will you please pray for me? How often do you say, my kids are really exposing the sinfulness in me in these ways? Will you please pray for me? How often do you say, I've got a doctor appointment coming up because my body's doing some weird stuff and I'm really anxious about it? Will you please pray for me? Community groups are a great place for this to happen. And we need community groups because we can't live life alone. We got to learn to do this stuff together. So I want to encourage you when somebody asks you how to pray, it's not being weird and oversharing. It's being honest. Let's be honest with one another. And I want to encourage you when you're in your community groups to let that time be real and not shallow and trite. Dig into the Word, dig into each other's hearts, dig into your distresses together because God knows them. And Jesus is our shelter in the sorrow, and that shelter is often expressed in one another. And when we do these things, we can do it in great confidence because as David shows us, God hears our prayer. Second part of verse 3 down to verse 5, he says, in the path where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see. There is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to my soul. No one cares for my soul. So I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. So we see there is that David is forgotten by man, but he is remembered by God. This is helpful because sometimes we're alone in our sorrows, aren't we? We might feel alone, or we might actually be alone. And David's hope can be our hope that through faith in Christ and our union with him, we are not alone. And even if we're not alone, we might be, again, in a way where we feel sort of stuck, as David was with the sorrow. And when we are stuck, we must learn with David to look to God as our help. We should pray to God in our sorrows because he hears us, as David assures us, and that he is our help. Matthew Henry again says this, we are common to show our troubles too much to ourselves, pouring upon them which does us no service, where instead, by showing them to God, we might cast the care upon the one who cares for us and thereby ease ourselves. So I just want to ask you, beloved, is prayer to God your first move when you're in trouble? Or when you're trying to get out of trouble? How often do you pray in that time? Or do you, like me often, just frantically start trying to figure stuff out? Just like your brain's just on a buzz. You ever get like that? It's like you're sober, but you're almost intoxicated because your brain is so anxious and you're just flying all over the place. And it's like a high you can't come down. It's like an anxiety-ridden high that you can't get off of. Well, prayer and slowing down and praying to God, I think, is a way we start to detox from that. We should learn to pray continually, first and continually in our sorrows, because as David found, God is our refuge. Jesus is our shelter in the sorrow. And here's a pointed point for us to consider to drill down a little bit more. When sorrow comes, whatever has the attention of our heart is our real refuge. When pain comes, whatever grabs the attention of our hearts first and loudest is where our real refuge is. So if I feel weird aches in my body and I'm obsessing over figuring out the source, then my physical health is my refuge and not God. If financial calamity strikes and I'm panicking just consistently, then money or security is my refuge, not God. See, our anxieties, brothers and sisters, often reveal our functional gods. If we want to know what is functionally my God, what makes me the most anxious? What makes me obsess in my life? And the problem is that these functional gods are no gods at all, and they're all so insufficient shelters for us. Why? Well, it's plainly obvious, because healthy bodies still die. That's a bad God if it can still die. A healthy body dies. Stock markets crash, and then the money is worth nothing in an instant. See, every functional shelter that we would try to build in this world is subject to the curse. So it is always waiting for someone to pull out the card on the bottom corner and just watch it all crash. There is no stability that can be found in anything in this world, no matter how much we believe in it, trust in it, or the numbers say it should work. It all works until it doesn't work. And it proves to be empty, to have been empty all along. But there is one refuge. There is one shelter who stands above the curse. And he was the one who was crushed beneath it, but raised in victory over it. And he stands as a firm foundation for all who will trust in him when the storm comes. And he stands as the one who, in fact, tells the storms to stop. There is a refuge in the person of Jesus, and he is our shelter in the sorrow. He is our safety in the storm. And so we pray to him, and we trust in him, and we cling to him, and we hope in him. Though the earth be moved and the mountains be thrown into the sea, we will trust in Jesus, who created the earth and calms the seas. And this is one of the things, dearly beloved, that our sorrows teach us, because it's good for us to know that Jesus is our shelter in the storm and that there is no other shelter to be found. God is the only real help for us. That doesn't mean he doesn't use means. That doesn't mean there's not things in the world that plays out within. But he is the only real help for us. And it is good for us to have to learn that sometimes by having all the other stuff fall apart. Learning this in our trials and beginning to live like this is how we start to become, like James taught us last week, perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. To trust only in God, to look only to Christ. For all of our first hope to be in him is how we become more fully human, meant to live in dependence upon the one who made us. Jesus is our shelter in the sorrow. And finally, we see in verses 6 and 7 that God rescued his king. He says, "Attend to my cry, for I am very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of prison, that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me." So there's a lot of hope for us. David ends on a high note. That should be hopeful for us. Number one, we can find some hope because David was rescued. Like, he didn't live on the run from Saul forever. A lot of times when sorrow sinks into deep depression lies to us, anxiety lies to us. It becomes a type of false prophet that tells us of a future that it does not know, and that is always a future that says there is no hope for deliverance. That's just not true. Often, the things that we do experience by the kindness of God do relent. That's often the case. It's not always the case, but it is often the case. And so sometimes in our sorrow, we need to take a step back, tell that false prophet to shut up because he does not speak God's truth, and to have a long-term picture and understand that this might be something that will work itself out, that God will work itself out in time, and I want to endure in faith until that comes. And in fact, we should pursue getting out of our sorrows as much as we can. If it's a bad boss, then we can look for another job. If it's a bad government, we can try to vote in somebody better. But we should pray and work in faith to change or improve our situation as we can. And that might be the means by which God brings us out of it. But sometimes we are stuck. We might just only be stuck in this moment because we don't have the knowledge, or sometimes it might just be We've exhausted the options and nothing has seemed to work, so we're stuck. We might be stuck in sorrow with no escape. We might be then compounding that because we're stuck in sin because our hearts are chewed up because we're continuing to place hope in refuges other than God. So then we're stuck as well. So what do we do then? Well, then we learn to place our hope in the rescue that is sure to come when Jesus returns. Because our great hope is indeed that God rescued his king, but it is not David. It is King Jesus that was rescued. And our great hope is that he was rescued. And if our faith is in him, then we will be rescued with him. And see, this psalm in a whole is not firstly about David, even though he wrote it. And even though we can see that God rescued him from his trial, the problem is David eventually did die, as all men do. Rather, this psalm is about Jesus. Because in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he awaited the cross, we see Jesus laying out his distresses to God. And in that same garden, we see Jesus all alone, abandoned by sleeping friends, and waiting for his betrayer to come and capture him, as David is praying about. And in the garden, we see Jesus pray to God as his refuge and give the clearest picture of such a thing when he asks him to remove the cup or give him the strength to drink it. But then Jesus didn't seem to end in quite the same high note, at least not at first, because he's dragged out of the garden, enveloped by his sorrow, and actually killed and buried beneath it. But God did indeed bring him out of the prison. Just as David prayed, God raised him from the grave, and there is an eternal kingdom where his righteous ones will surround him because God has dealt bountifully with him. See, he is our shelter because he understands our sorrow. He is our shelter because he was consumed by sin, Satan, and death, which is the source of our sorrow, and he raised in victory over it. And he has secured this victory for all who will trust in him, so that those who believe in Jesus Christ and have tethered their life to him can say with joy today the words of verse 7. No matter what your situation is, you can say truly, joyfully, not pop psychology, not trying to lift yourself out of a pit and relying on just sort of picking yourself up. You can say with joy, the righteous will surround me because God has dealt bountifully with me, because he has dealt bountifully with his son. He has delivered him, raised him, and I am with him. And so what is true of him will be true of me on the last day. So if you're here and you're a Christian, I want to appeal to you that Jesus is your shelter, the person to comfort you, the work that guarantees your eternal victory. He is your shelter. So don't look anywhere else. Don't seek it in other places. Cast all of your functional shelters away and look to Jesus alone. And ask God to help you, because that's not easy. I wrote out a prayer this week, and I said, I want to want righteousness more than comfort. Because I couldn't even write, I want righteousness more than comfort, because it wasn't true. It wasn't true the state of my heart. But I want to want Jesus to be my shelter more than something else. Right now, like, my heart struggles with that. And so sometimes that's what our prayers look like, is help me to want to let this thing go. I remember years ago, Chatter preaching a sermon that I always remembered, and he talked about going somewhere. I don't remember all of it. He went somewhere, he went on top of a rock or something, mountain. But I just remember him saying, like, he told God, like, he wasn't coming back down until, like, God actually changed his heart. And it always stuck with me because I feel that way a lot. Like, that's how we live. Like, we need God to actually change us. And so ask God to help you to desire for Jesus to be your shelter, not these other things. These other things, hold on tight. Like, to let go of them feels like dying. To let go of that hope, to let go of that security, to let go of that peace in that thing. To actually learn to believe that if I die, I will be with Jesus, and that's better. Ask God to help you to know that Jesus is your shelter in the sorrow. And if you're here and you're not a Christian, I just want to appeal to you that Jesus can be your shelter in all of your sorrows. And I think you would probably agree that in all of your sorrows, which you have certainly faced, at least some, you have looked many places for comfort and joy. And I would just ask you, what's the result been of that? Have you found joy? Have you found comfort? Have you found hope? Or have you found things that have been short-lived for a time that ultimately led to even greater heartbreak than you started with? If that's you, I want to encourage you, implore you, plead with you today to look to Jesus in faith, to turn from your sin and your selfishness and to trust in him and to follow him, and you can find Jesus to be a shelter in your sorrow. You see, God humbled his king, God knows our distresses, and God hears our prayers, and God rescued his king, and he will rescue all who are in him. Jesus is our shelter in the sorrow. Let me pray for us.